The arrogant rich man picked the wrong woman to mock. His laughter sliced through the restaurant, sharp and cruel. Her tired eyes locked onto his. "Mock me again." Her voice was low, almost gentle, but carried a razor's edge. He had no idea what storm was about to break. Within moments, every smug word he had spoken would turn against him. The Sterling Room was more than a restaurant. It was Manhattan's shrine of status. Crystal chandeliers shimmered from the ceiling, glowing warmly across polished tables where fortunes were negotiated and reputations cemented. White orchids decorated each setting, their fragile petals reflecting the delicate egos seated beneath them. To step into this place was to declare your belonging among New York's elite. Margaret Walker pushed open the heavy glass doors, immediately drawing curious stares. Her plain black dress, chosen only for comfort after a grueling 20-hour flight from Singapore, draped loosely over her frame. Wrinkles whispered of long waits at airport gates and cramped economy seats. Her chestnut hair, once carefully styled, had unraveled during travel, strands escaping to frame her weary face. Faint shadows under her eyes told the story of sleepless meetings and jet lag's relentless grip. She hadn't even stopped at her hotel, coming straight from JFK with just a small carry-on, which she now tucked discreetly beside the host's podium. "Antonio is expecting me," she said quietly, her voice calm but firm. The host gave her a doubtful glance before leading her forward. At the center table sat Richard Harrington, a hedge fund manager infamous for his arrogance. His designer suit fit him like armor, his expensive Swiss watch catching the light as he moved with deliberate precision. Around him sat equally polished companions hanging on every word. Richard thrived on belittling others: waiters, shopgirls, tourists, anyone he could publicly humiliate with a clever barb. He collected such moments like trophies, feeding on the rush of dominance. The moment Margaret entered, his sharp eyes scanned her wrinkled clothes, her travel-worn shoes, her lack of glittering accessories. A sly grin crept across his face, the grin that had preceded countless humiliations. Loud enough for others to hear, he sneered, well, looks like someone wandered in from the diner down the block." Laughter rippled from his table, drawing more eyes toward Margaret, but unlike his usual prey, she didn't shrink. Margaret lifted her gaze, steady and unflinching, her exhaustion giving way to something sharper, measured, calculating. The hunter was being watched by his prey. She opened the menu, her fingers stiff from hours in recycled airplane air. The Sterling Room's golden light spilled across the spotless tablecloth as Richard's stare burned into her, cataloging every supposed flaw. The faint coffee stain on her sleeve, her plain shoes, her lack of luxury jewelry. The young waiter approached with a polished smile, though his expression faltered slightly at her appearance. Carefully, he suggested the prix-fixe menu, sidestepping mention of the lavish tasting menu. His eyes flickered toward Richard's table as if checking whether he was handling the situation correctly. "The full tasting menu, please," Margaret said evenly, her tone carrying quiet authority. "And sparkling water for now. I'll choose the wine after speaking with Antonio." The casual mention of the owner's name startled the waiter, though he masked it quickly with a nod before retreating. Richard's laugh pierced the air like a knife. "Better check your credit card first, sweetheart. That meal costs more than your whole outfit." Heads turned. In the Sterling Room, these public takedowns were part of the unspoken ritual, reminders of who belonged inside the circle and who should remain firmly outside. Margaret took a slow sip of water, her eyes locked on Richard's. "I'm sure I'll manage." Her calm confidence only sharpened his determination to break her. He leaned back in his chair, wearing disdain like a costume, every movement exaggerated for the audience he knew was watching. The tilt of his head was an open invitation for others to join in his judgment. "Let me guess," Richard drawled, his words dripping with mockery. "Big night out? Once-in-a-lifetime splurge? Or just plain lost?" Each question was a dart, carefully aimed to puncture dignity. "Tourist bucket list, maybe? Next time, try somewhere the real New Yorkers eat." Margaret placed her napkin across her lap with deliberate calm. "Just hungry," she replied simply. The brevity of her answer unsettled him far more than a long defense would have. The room quieted. Conversations dimmed as nearby tables tuned in, unwilling witnesses to a spectacle unfolding in real time. Richard raised his voice, making sure everyone heard. "There's a decent diner 10 blocks south," he mocked. "Plastic menus, free refills, that's more your ambiance." He exaggerated the final word as though teaching vocabulary to a child. His companions chuckled on cue, feeding off his cruelty. A woman draped in diamonds tried and failed to hide her smirk. An older man frowned faintly but stayed silent, his inaction heavy in the air. "Thank you for the suggestion," Margaret said evenly. "Perhaps another time." The waiter returned with sparkling water, his hand trembling slightly as he poured. Richard caught the young man's eye and winked, a conspiratorial gesture that said, "We both know she doesn't belong here." Shoulders stiffening, the waiter finished quickly and retreated, avoiding Margaret's gaze. Another small victory claimed by Richard. He rose from his seat, wineglass in hand, strolling toward her table like a predator closing in on its prey. The room seemed to hold its breath. Even the soft classical music faded into the background. "I'm only trying to spare you the embarrassment," Richard said smoothly, feigning concern. "This place has standards. Don't you think it feels a little aspirational for someone like you?" The Sterling room had transformed into a stage, Richard's center spotlight, Margaret cast as his unwilling foil. At a nearby table, a woman discreetly raised her phone, sensing a moment worth recording. "Someone like me?" Margaret repeated softly, locking eyes with him for the first time. Something flickered in her gaze. Not anger, not fear, but a quiet depth that unsettled him. It vanished before he could define it. For just a moment, Richard faltered, thrown off by the intensity. He quickly straightened, scanning the room to make sure his audience hadn't drifted. "Well, let's be honest," he pressed on. "You're clearly not from around here." He gestured at her attire with his free hand, the diamond cufflink flashing under the chandelier. "The Sterling room has a certain clientele, a level of quality we expect." The air grew heavier. Even the waitstaff, trained to appear invisible, hesitated mid-step. A sommelier froze mid-pour, wine suspended above crystal as though time itself had stalled. "And you're the judge of quality?" Margaret asked, her voice still calm but edged with steel. Several diners shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Her tone wasn't defensive, it was analytical, like she was examining him under glass. Richard laughed loudly, playing to the crowd. "I don't have to be. Quality speaks for itself. And so does—" He gestured at her again with a smirk. "The lack of it." This time the laughter was weaker, scattered. Some diners glanced away. A young woman with a designer purse lowered her eyes, suddenly unwilling to be part of his performance. "Interesting perspective," Margaret said, folding her hands neatly on the table. Something had shifted in her demeanor. The fatigue in her expression gave way to a sharpened calm, her presence suddenly precise, deliberate. Years seemed to fall away as her exhaustion melted into poise. Richard, misreading her composure as weakness, moved closer, certain he still controlled the room. "Look, I'm doing you a favor. Places like this eat little strays like you." "Mr. Harrington," Margaret cut in, her voice cool but commanding. She hadn't raised it, yet every word carried clearly through the room. "Is public humiliation always your opening move? Or is tonight's cruelty reserved just for me?" The restaurant froze. Not a fork scraped, not a glass clinked. Every eye was locked on the confrontation, unexpected, electric, impossible to ignore. The balance of power, so firmly in Richard's hands moments earlier, suddenly began to tilt. His confident grin faltered, stiffening at the edges. For the first time that evening, uncertainty crept into his eyes. She knew his name. She hadn't guessed, she knew. The Sterling room went completely silent, its once busy hum dissolving into a tense stillness. Richard's smirk lingered awkwardly, while Margaret's steady gaze held him in place. "I make it a point to know the regulars," she said, her travel-worn appearance disguising the steel beneath her words. Richard blinked, then scrambled to recover. "Homework or not, you still look like you wandered in from the bus station," he said louder, forcing his voice to carry for the audience. "Standards matter here." Margaret lowered her glass with deliberate precision. The weariness in her eyes shifted into something far more dangerous, an unmistakable recognition of a predator who had chosen the wrong prey. "Mock me again," she said softly. The words barely rose above a whisper, yet they froze the room. Not a question, not quite a threat, but a warning heavy with consequence. Richard let out a hollow laugh. "Or what exactly?" Her eyes never moved from his. "Antonio," she called suddenly, her voice ringing with authority. Across the restaurant, a distinguished man looked up at once. Recognition and concern washed over his face as he spotted her. The room held its collective breath. Antonio's head snapped up, and in a heartbeat he abandoned his conversation. "Margaret," he exclaimed, striding toward her with urgency. The normally composed owner of the Sterling room moved with purpose, his expression stripped of polish, replaced by genuine concern. Margaret's features softened as he approached, warmth breaking through her exhaustion. Their reunion radiated familiarity, the affection of old friends. "What is happening here?" Antonio asked firmly, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. His posture alone spoke volumes to the diners now riveted to every moment. "This gentleman was instructing me on your restaurant standards," Margaret said evenly. "Apparently I don't qualify." Antonio's face darkened with fury. He straightened to his full height and turned toward Richard. "You were lecturing Margaret Walker about standards?" Richard shifted uneasily, suddenly aware he had stepped into unfamiliar territory. "Just a bit of harmless—" "There's nothing harmless about disrespect in my house." Antonio cut him off, his voice sharp, his accent thickening with emotion. "Especially not toward the woman who guided my children through college, who taught my Sophia to play the piano, who has shared Thanksgiving at my table for 15 years. The dining room was so silent that every word carried effortlessly. "Do you even realize who Margaret Walker is?" Antonio's voice rang across the room. Richard's throat tightened. When my wife Lucia opened her gallery, no bank would touch her," Antonio pressed on, his tone heavy with memory. "It was Margaret who believed in her. Margaret who stood godmother to our children. Margaret whose wisdom saw us through trials you could never imagine." Diners leaned forward, caught in the gravity of his words. A woman at the next table nodded knowingly, while others shifted, ashamed of their earlier amusement. "The woman you ridicule for her simple dress built half the schools in her hometown," Antonio continued, gesturing toward Margaret. "The woman you mocked has done more good for this world than you could in 10 lifetimes." Antonio touched the earpiece tucked discreetly at his collar. Security. 2 suited men appeared instantly, flanking Richard with silent precision. "Mr. Harrington is no longer welcome at the Sterling room," Antonio declared for all to hear. "Nor in any of my family's establishments." Richard's face burned crimson. "You can't—" "I can. And I have." Antonio's words cut through him. "The Sterling room is more than a restaurant, Mr. Harrington. It is my family's legacy, and in my family we recognize the difference between wealth and worth." He turned to his men. "Through the kitchen. He is unworthy of our front door." Gasps rippled across the room as Richard was escorted away, his arrogant posture now reduced to a humiliating shuffle. Diners who had chuckled at his cruelty minutes earlier avoided eye contact, complicit in silence. Antonio turned back to Margaret, taking her hands with warmth. "Forgive me," he said softly. "Had I known you were arriving tonight, I would have welcomed you properly." "Lucia will be furious she missed you." Margaret smiled softly. "I came straight from the airport. I couldn't miss Sophia's recital tomorrow." Around them, the restaurant erupted in spontaneous applause. Not applause for wealth or status, but for the genuine bond they had all just witnessed. It was a reminder that real standards had nothing to do with designer clothes or appearances, but everything to do with character. Antonio rose with pride, addressing the room with authority and warmth. "Ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy your evening. And remember, here we measure people by the kindness in their hearts, not the labels on their clothes." Turning back to Margaret, his sternness melted into a warm smile. "Now shall we call Lucia and the children? They'll be overjoyed to know you've finally arrived safely." 3 days later, Richard Harrington stood in his penthouse overlooking Central Park, staring at his phone in disbelief. The video had gone viral overnight. Shaky recordings from multiple diners captured everything: his arrogant mockery, Margaret's calm composure, Antonio's thunderous defense, and Richard's humiliating march through the kitchen exit. The hashtag Dr. Bossy Rich Bully was trending nationwide. His social media accounts were losing thousands of followers by the hour. Business partners stopped returning his calls. Dinner invitations disappeared without explanation. The empire of fear and intimidation he had built was collapsing like glass under pressure. Comments flooded in. Finally, someone stood up to him. "Been waiting years for this. This is the same man who once reduced my sister to tears when she served his table." Richard's phone buzzed again. A message from his publicist read, "This cannot be fixed. Strongly recommend a social media blackout. We'll discuss an exit strategy tomorrow. Exit strategy. The word stung, as if he were nothing more than a failed investment. Meanwhile, across town in a modest neighborhood, the mood was entirely different. Laughter floated through a backyard filled with children playing tag on the grass, while adults gathered around picnic tables stacked with homemade dishes. The smell of barbecue filled the summer air. Margaret, now refreshed and comfortable in jeans and a simple blouse, stood next to Antonio at the grill. Both held bottles of beer, laughing and sharing stories like the old friends they were. "You should have seen his face," Antonio chuckled, expertly flipping burgers. "In 20 years of owning the Sterling Room, I've never enjoyed kicking someone out more." Margaret smiled, glancing at Antonio's youngest daughter teaching her children to play volleyball. "Some lessons have to be learned in public," she said quietly. "Powerful people rarely listen otherwise." Antonio lowered his voice. "Speaking of power, Singapore went well?" Margaret nodded, sipping her drink. "The water access deal is signed. By next year, 5 million people will have clean water, worth every hour of that flight." As twilight settled over the gathering, no one spoke of Richard Harrington or the Sterling Room scandal. Among true friends and family, titles and wealth meant nothing. What mattered was simple: laughter, food, and the bonds of genuine connection. A richness that Richard, despite all his money, would never understand. And so as the sun sets on this story of unexpected triumph, we're reminded that true power is never found in expensive suits or exclusive tables. It lives in the quiet dignity of those who know their worth, no matter how others perceive them. Margaret's journey, from being mocked to commanding respect, played out in just minutes. Yet its impact will linger in the hearts of all who witnessed it. How many times have you judged someone by their appearance, only to later discover the depth of their character? Have you ever been underestimated or seen someone dismissed because they didn't fit the expected image? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from too. Together, we're building a community that values depth over superficial judgment. If this story touched you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit subscribe and join us in celebrating dignity, kindness, and the everyday heroes who change lives. And remember, in a world that's quick to judge, sometimes the strongest words are the quietest ones. Mock me again. New stories of resilience, justice, and unlikely heroes arrive every week. Turn on the bell so you never miss the moment when someone like Margaret walks into a room and changes everything. Because in the end, the most powerful people aren't always the loudest. They're the ones who stand tall in silence, grounded in their truth,